Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. And as always, thank you so much for listening to the program, and thank you for supporting the program. And I will just quickly say that you can go to jeffersonhour.com to contact the show and to support the show. There's a number of ways you can do it, and we so appreciate it, and it helps us to continue this work. You can also go to jeffersonhour.com to find out about all the upcoming events on Clay's schedule, including a trip to France and you have some more Loxa Lodge meetings coming up. Do you want to talk about that?
There are 2 retreats in January of 2023 at Loxa Lodge west of Missoula in a wonderful winter sort of wonderland. Not cold, but snowy, and snug we are in our meeting room with a great roaring fire. But the themes for this coming January are the return journey of Lewis and Clark. That gets almost no attention in Lewis and Clark studies because the author has spent most of her or his time getting them to the Pacific and then kind of rushes them back to St. Louis. But the return journey is in many respects as interesting as the outbound, and in some respects more. So that's one. And the other one is on 2 novels by Dostoevsky. I could only do 2 because they're so long and wonderfully complicated. One is Crime and Punishment, which is virtually my favorite novel, and the other is The Brothers Karamazov, which some people believe to be the greatest novel ever written. So those 2 novels for one 5-day retreat, and the other, The Return of Lewis and Clark. But more immediately, I'm starting an online course now on the Enlightenment and its discontents, and we'll be reading Voltaire's Candide, the fabulous, magnificent Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, which is actually a much darker book than you remember, and then Yuval Harari's recent masterpiece, Homo Deus, about his optimistic view of the future. And David, before we go, I just want to say I watched him yesterday. This would be in mid-March. In an interview about the Ukraine situation. He was in Tel Aviv, I think, and it was a 48-minute interview. You can find it on YouTube. And he was absolutely stunning in his insights. I mean, he is one of the best minds of our time. He knows whereof he speaks, and he spoke about the Ukraine catastrophe in such moving and insightful ways. And what he basically told us is that this destabilizes the entire world, that the whole world is going to pay a price for one hubristic man's savage attack on a sovereign neighbor people, that this is not a regional conflict. It may not become World War III, but this is something that's going to have ramifications across the planet, not just in higher prices and inflation and higher fuel costs and so on. But it may create copycat invasions. It shatters the world order that was established after the debacle of World War II. And he believes that the world must stop this before it becomes a new norm. And he, of course, also is not absolutely certain that this will not end in the use of nuclear or chemical weapons. So it's a brilliant, superb interview with Yuval Harari that anyone can find for free on YouTube.
Meanwhile, let's get to this week's show. It's another Clay Jenkinson one-on-one conversation. Just a fascinating woman who's written this great book, and a former student of yours, Joanne Freeman.
Yeah, so these one-on-one interviews are really extremely gratifying. And just to explain to people, I've been doing some work for Governing magazine, and we're creating a much larger initiative called Listening to America, and we're sort of morphing the Jefferson Hour carefully and slowly into more of a Listening to America program. Jefferson will still be here, of course, but it won't be as often, and I will be out of character probably more often than in. But these interviews are arranged for me with people that I just say, I'd like to talk to Joanne Freeman, I'd like to talk to Dexter, etc. And here they come. And so you're not always available. You're working on this gigantic new project of cylinder disc recordings made on the Northern Plains at the start of the 20th century. So we're giving you a little bit of relief. We're not letting you disappear, of course, because the semi-permanent guest host must never disappear. But these interviews are ones that I conduct on my own time, and then you painstakingly listen to them. They're fascinating, and then we present them to our Jefferson Hour people.
And this one's really great. It was so much fun to listen to the two of you back and forth. With that, shall we go to the show?
Yeah, so I should say Joanne Freeman is a vile Hamiltonian and has always been one. That's a bone of contention between us since 1985, roughly. She's gone on to have a spectacular, magnificent career, and it's an honor to have even had a chance to teach her how to write a footnote way back when. This is a book that I think is going to be an important book in American historiography. It's about the bloody fisticuffs and brawls on the floor of the United States Congress between 1820 and the outbreak of the Civil War. So let's go to the program and listen to my interview one-on-one with Professor Joanne Freeman of Yale University.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week, we present another one of the one-on-one conversations with Clay Jenkinson. And Clay, your guest this week is Joanne Freeman, here to talk about her new book, The Field of Blood, Violence in Congress and the Road to Civil War. She's a self-described political historian and incidentally a former student of yours.
Just long ago, I taught English literature at Pomona College in Southern California, and she was a young student. She was a Hamiltonian even then. She was a Hamiltonian before I was a Jeffersonian, but we'll leave that alone for the moment. And she's a very celebrated professor of history at Yale University. And this book on bloodshed and squabbling on the floors of Congress has really opened some new ground, David. We all knew that there had been some of this, but we didn't know how much. And she spent years unearthing these sort of buried quarrels and duels and near duels.
Yes, it's a fascinating book. She did some incredible research, which maybe we'll talk about later in the program. But I'm trying to think of the right adjective to describe her writing. It's juicy, let me put it that way. But you say she had you on page one. In the introduction, she writes about one of your favorite authors.
Charles Dickens came to this country in 1842. He came again in the 1860s. And he toured America. He actually made some enemies in 1842 because he spent so much time talking about intellectual property and trying to protect his books from unauthorized pirate editions that many Americans became a little tired of the great Charles Dickens. But I love a historian who knows literature. Joanne Freeman is one such historian, and she begins with Charles Dickens at the beginning of the book because he noticed some indecorous behavior in Congress.
Could you share that passage, perhaps read it, the one that intrigued you so much?
Yes, this is from the first page of the book. I'm quoting now. Charles Dickens was intrigued by many things during the 1842 visit to America, but in Washington one thing stood out: tobacco chewing. The practice repulsed him wherever he found it, but it was, quote, in its full bloom and glory in the nation's capital, the headquarters of tobacco-tinctured saliva, said Dickens. Looking on from a seat of honor on the House floor, he found it, quote, remarkable, to say the least, to see so many honorable members with swelled faces, their chairs tilted back and their feet on their desks, shaping a plug with their penknives and shooting the old plugs from their mouths, quote, as from a pop gun, and, quoting again, clapping the new one in its place. And heaven help anyone who drops something on the spittoon-battered floor, quoting, I strongly recommend all strangers not to look at the floor, Dickens advised, and if they happen to drop anything, not to pick it up with an ungloved hand on any account.
And so she describes this institution of ours, Congress. I thought that was pretty interesting.
I think that's gone. I don't think they chew tobacco or spit on the floor anymore.
There's one other paragraph she writes that really sets up the book. Would you read that for us?
Certainly. She writes, nations don't tear themselves in two accompanied by poetic strains of eloquence alone. Congressional proceedings in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s weren't pretty. The high-stakes political struggles of those decades were accompanied by insults and brawls as often as they were quieted temporarily by strategic compromises. Even the worthiest of congressional worthies had their ugly moments. Swearing, blustering, threats, and personal insults, known as personalities, were coined of the congressional realm, and fisticuffs were common enough to seem routine.
Ha. Well, I don't know how much we've progressed, although it's been a long time since we've seen fisticuffs on the floor of the Senate or the House.
Yes, I love her writing because she obviously enjoys what she gets to do so much, and she has a certain fascination with this sort of brawling. I don't quite understand why, but it's very interesting. And, what's so important about her book is that we knew a little of this, but not nearly enough. And what she has shown is, and she's a pioneer in this, that there was much more violence, fisticuffs, brawling, swearing, blustering, threatening, and so on, during the period between 1820 and 1860 than we previously have thought. And it was sort of covered up by a weak media, by a flattering media, and by, today we have Congressional Quarterly and we have congressional records and so on. Such records as there were in the time frequently just said, well, a certain intensity occurred on the floor over this debate. And then it turns out it was a brawl.
Well, we'll get into that and what her research led her to a little later in the conversation. But let's go to this conversation with Joanne Freeman.
So let me tell you this. You had me at Charles Dickens.
Oh, okay. Page 1.
The first 2 words of your book are Charles Dickens. Was intrigued by many things during his 1842 visit to the United States. One of them was spitting expectoration on the floors of Congress, and Dickens felt we were semi-barbaric, which of course
Indeed.
Apparently we were. So you had me right off the bat. Here's my first question. It's amazing the extent to which the South has held the United States hostage from the beginning. So if you look at the Constitutional Convention, the North conceded way more than any one of us would have wished. And maybe, according to some historians, maybe more than they actually had to do to the South to get the Union then. And on and on and on. At each step, the slave power, as you call it, has been able to either silence the North or disarm the North or to beat up the North. But it's gotten its way, not just through 1865, but long into the future, into the Civil Rights Acts at least. And you could make the case that race and slavery still hold up the business of America. And so as a historian, when you looked at this particular period, what do you make of this as a historian, that the history of this country can have been so fundamentally and repeatedly compromised by race?
That's quite an opening question there, Clay. It's a big
Take it all day.
So let me answer that in pieces. One obvious factor here from the beginning has been a slave regime, a slavery-based regime, the South, is grounded on violence, is grounded on quote-unquote mastery, right? Is grounded on a variety of different things that obviously, as the book discusses, came in highly useful when you're in a national body with people who do not play by those rules. Being willing to be violent, being more likely to be armed, being willing to take things that far, and being united on the issue of slavery and ultimately race, that was powerful for them, and that was, I think it's John Quincy Adams, who at one point is talking about, fuming about the fact that the Southerners and the South have this kind of power and always have had. And the language he uses, he says something like that the Southerners march in solid phalanx. They're a unit. And particularly on the issue of slavery, and he doesn't use the word race, but that too, that if you are the people who don't want to play by the rules, who are willing to be violent, who feel that your constituents are actually kind of happy if you're fighting for them in that literal kind of a way, and who are all basically unified on the question of white power and the need to preserve and protect slavery in the United States, that's a really powerful force. So that even when slavery is no longer here, even when we get past that point, I still think in some way or another, and this is going to be, I will pause before saying this because this is the kind of statement that a historian backpedals quickly from. So I will say it's a sweeping generalization, But, there are recent sociological studies that talk about the culture of honor in the South and the fact that Southerners generally are more comfortable with person-to-person violence. Not to say that the North isn't violent, but even throughout the 19th century, the North was big on riots, right? The South was better with person-to-person violence. But there is a Southern culture bound up with the legacy of race and slavery that still exists. And you can't draw straight lines in history, really, but you can definitely see threads. And I think what the question you just asked is really highlighting one of those major threads in American history.
But we're now aware of this maybe more than we have been for a long time because of the Me Too movement and the George Floyd killing and all of these things. So we're especially sensitive to questions of historic and structural injustice in maybe a way that hasn't occurred in your career at this level until now. And so your book is very timely. And so if you had written the book in 1970, the violence would have been more interesting than the race question, than the slave question. But today you can't not see it at every step.
Right.
You think, so you have all these people that are these conservatives who are decrying the 1619 Project and cancel culture and all this stuff. And yet your book is not about that. Your book is about institutional dysfunction. You say that politics is war by other means and war is politics by other means. The country has to be coming apart for violence to be played out on the floor of the United States House of Representatives. And so you don't have to be especially tuned to race to realize that this is a crisis in American life. And then when you look behind, when you say, okay, why then was there so much violence during this period? Or did they just love to fight in the age of eye gouging and ear biting? Or is there a reason for this? And the reason has to be fear of loss of power in Congress. And that has to, as you've said, that has to do with things like tariffs and all sorts of other things. It's not merely slavery, but it's probably slavery.
It is, because the nation, this is the period, the book covers 1830s, 40s, and 1850s. And that's huge growth happening nationally. And every single new state raises this issue. And so in part, that's an issue of, will slavery spread? In part, that's an issue of, will northern states have a preponderance of power because there will be more free states? In part, it's the future of slavery. And is it going to be bound into the South, or is it going to actually be allowed to spread? So you're right that it is all about slavery, but it's also really about maintaining power at a time where it's not really clear where national power is going to go. And a group of people not being entirely sure that they have, in essence, the demographics nationally to hang on to power. What do you do when you're not sure that by democratic means you're going to be able to maintain power? Well, violence is awfully handy, isn't it? As a way to basically, politics by other means. If you can intimidate people into backing down or into assuming that you actually are a majority, that's a powerful maneuver. And the book shows Southerners basically threatening and intimidating Northerners into backing down on a lot of things, and more often than not, the issue of slavery. The key to that is they're violent sometimes. They don't have to be violent all the times. They just have to be seemingly willing to be violent.
We need to take a short break from this conversation, but there's much more to come. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week, a one-on-one conversation between Clay Jenkinson and the author Joanne Freeman. And Clay, as you continue this conversation with her, you ask her about how many Northerners were really in favor of ending slavery, and the answer turns out to be not many. This was really a violent period in American history.
It was, David. Northerners attacked the South for slavery, what they called slaveocracy and the slave economy and so on. And what I wanted to know was, is this genuine compassion for enslaved people, or is this sort of just a political tool that the North was able to use to get back at the South, which had gotten way too much constitutional authority back in the founding moment of 1787? And one of the things that Joanne suggests in this book is that this was a violent time. This was not just on the floors of Congress, but this was a violent time in America's history. And I'll just read you this one paragraph from her book. In 1835 alone, she writes, there were 109 riots nationwide. There was the war with Mexico between 1846 and 48, a battle that inflamed the nation's slavery problem and stoked sectional passions. In the 1850s, there was the murderously brutal fight over slavery and statehood in Bleeding, Kansas. And of course, there was the institution of slavery itself and the violence and cruelty at its core. Politics was also violent. There was hand-to-hand combat and rioting at polling places. On one memorable occasion in Washington in 1857, 3 nativist gangs, the Plug Uglies, the Chunkers, and the Rip Raps, joined forces to terrorize immigrants casting votes, causing a riot. When the panicked mayor called in the Marines, the 3 gangs hauled a cannon into play, though they never fired it, and by the time the brawl subsided, several people had been killed. My goodness. And so with that as a brief introduction, David, let's rejoin my conversation with my former student, prize student, Joanne Freeman of Yale University.
So you have the people that just, we got to hold the union together. This problem will solve itself some way. We're not going to solve it here, but we must not let the union break up. Then you have the people who want to hold their party together, which has both a northern and a southern wing. And so they have to be accommodating to the variety of views within their own party. How many of the Northerners who are pushing during this period, who are attacking the South in one way or another as barbaric or as clinging to this institution, how many of them are genuinely concerned about the human rights of African Americans?
Not an enormous number. It's sad but true. And this is the most obvious example of this is John Quincy Adams, who, after he's president, he goes back and serves in Congress in the House. And he's really good. He's better in Congress, I think, than he was as a president. And he wants to act out and fight slavery and the slaveholders. But he's strategic and dour and kind of, a no nonsense kind of a person. And so he very blatantly believes and says that people in the North, if I get up here and I talk about the horrors of slavery, maybe they'll care, maybe they won't. If I get up here and say your petitions attacking slavery are not getting accepted in the House, and so your right of petition, Northerners, your rights are being violated, they're going to get really upset, way more upset than they ever will be over the question of slavery and what's happening with slavery. So that's what he does strategically, right? He's like, let's talk about your right of petition, your fundamental constitutional right of petition. And sure enough, Northerners are outraged. That debate isn't ultimately really about slavery. It's about getting Northerners riled up to care. And even the Republican Party, which comes about in the mid-1850s, and it is an anti-slavery party, but it's anti-slavery partly because there are people who want free labor in the West, because that'll be better for, poor white people. It's actually not about slavery. There are a variety of reasons to be against slavery, and a whole bunch of them have nothing to do with the fate and the moral question of what is happening to African Americans.
The more you kind of come to terms with that, for example, the Constitutional Convention, many statements arguing against slavery by delegates like Gouverneur Morris and others. And yet almost all of them were really talking about power, not about enslaved people.
Right.
And isn't that basically been the case mostly?
Yeah, I think that is very true. I mean, in a way, it sort of feels like you're saying people in politics are always talking about power. And then the answer is, well, yeah. But in addition to that, you're right. That is what it's about, is how do we have power? How do we keep power? What do we do to manage our power? And the slavery issue is bound up with that. But at the core of it is the question of what do we need to do to keep power? And what can we or can we not do? How much can we not change or not compromise and still maintain the kind of power we want?
Assuming there were no slavery in the United States, there was free labor throughout. There would have been sectional differences between North and South. One's more agrarian, one's becoming industrial, et cetera, and so on. But it's hard to imagine these debates being as virulent as they were if it's just about balance of power.
They were not shooting each other over tariffs. It was the question of the good of the North and the good of the South, and questions of the nature of the South and the slave power, insulting the reputation or it was either about the sectionalism or the direction the nation was going. But yeah, that's a different thing entirely.
You started by saying slavery can only be maintained with man-on-man violence. You can posit your benign Jefferson slaveholder all you want, but basically slavery exists by the threat of violence and the use of violence, right?
Right.
And so, and Jefferson rightly says that the parent storms, the child looks on, that this is a culture that repeats itself. It's toxic. It poisons itself generation after generation. And so when you look at the Southern propensity for violence during this era and up to our own, including lynching, that bespeaks a weakness of argument, right? If you and I get into an argument at a history conference and you beat me up, either you are a vicious person, which is at least possible, or
you have nothing to say.
Right.
Yeah.
And so were there Southern intellectuals who said, this can't be okay, that we can only maintain this thing by intimidation, bullying, violence, duels. The argument can't be really good on our side if we have to resort to this.
Well, there are Southern intellectuals. Some of them are doing what you wouldn't be surprised that Southern intellectuals would do, which is slavery is a positive good. It's serving African Americans well. These people couldn't do well without it. We're kind. We treat our slaves, all of that hoo-ha. And they tie that into, and the South, it shows you the South, what a civilized people we are, and blah, blah, blah. So there are intellectuals, and not all of them are taking this really kind of obvious tack, but some of them are. And that's true from the beginning, too. You have people defending the institution of slavery on a pseudo-moralistic level for a very long time.
To this day.
Well, that's true.
There are people now who will say, and publicly, that slavery was on the whole good for African enslaved people.
Yeah, we live in a really interesting time, Clay.
My only point is that those arguments don't go away. So the biblical argument has largely disappeared, but the argument that somehow this was a positive institution for a benighted people who would remain benighted if we hadn't done them this favor, that argument exists at that time. But that's not the argument I'm hoping for. I'm hoping for the argument of a Southern person who says, if we can only maintain our power by way of a set of constitutional tricks like the 3/5 clause in the Electoral College and by physical violence or threats of violence, we're probably on the wrong side of history. You're not finding those in this argument.
I mean, so I've been looking mostly at congressmen. So no, I have not seen Southern congressmen making that kind of argument. There had to be other Southerners of larger mind who were capable of seeing that and making that kind of argument. But in Congress, they're not often thinking about being on the right or wrong side of history, right? They're talking about power. They're thinking about what has to happen immediately here for me to get what I want. How can I do that and keep my party happy and my power on the floor happy and good, and please my constituents and please my section of the union? And so they're all focused on the balance of power that surrounds them more than anything else. They're constantly calculating power. But one of the things that they have to add into their calculations, and this is true North and South, is a level of physical force that we just haven't plugged into that equation really in the past.
One of the things you say that I found so intriguing is that some of these Southerners were captives of their own constituency that were egging them on to be violent, who rewarded them for violence, who were pushing them to be more extreme and more uncompromising in Congress, a phenomenon that exists today, too, so that a congressman has to go back to face his constituency in Alabama or Kentucky. And he knows that if he got into a little brawl with somebody from the North, that's actually good news in that constituency.
And even that could be good news, number one. And bad news would be if someone confronted him or shoved him or did something and he didn't respond with the proper amount of oomph and anger and potentially a physical response. So not only might it be positive that you're fighting in that way, which it very often was, if you don't respond that way, you could be in trouble. There's my most frequent fighter in Congress is Henry Wise of Virginia. And he does, I think, get involved in more fights than anybody else, but he also is the guy who says what you're not supposed to say and says it out loud very brashly all the time. So as a historian, I could see in the congressional record Henry Wise standing up, it's like, excellent. Like, what is he going to say? And one of the things, at some point, someone says to him, you should be ashamed of yourself. You've been involved in 12 brawls in the time that I've known you here, and you ought to be just sent home. Why are you here? Aren't you ashamed of yourself? And Henry Wise stands up and says, okay, send me home. Go ahead and try and send me home, because you know what's going to happen? I'm going to be reelected and put right back here because I'm put here to do this. They want me to do this. They look for me to do this. I have been reelected 5, 6 times. And this is in an era when you have a lot of one-term wonders in Congress where, people get elected for one term and then poof, they're gone from the historical record. Henry Wise reelected and reelected and reelected, and he's famous for being a fighter. So he's totally right when he says, yeah, send me home, go right ahead. I'll be back here. I'll be back here in 10 minutes. And he says at other points, things like, all I need to do my job is a weapon, a fair playing field, and a good friend. Thank you, Henry Wise.
Of these scores of violent events, not many led to actual duels. And I know from your book, Affairs of Honor, that most affairs of honor peter out well this side of the proving grounds. But you only feature a couple that led to actual dueling.
Right. And which is a really good point to make, because I think a lot of people assume that duels are about killing, and that this kind of behavior with the honor offense and all that other sort of stuff is about creating duels and then killing people. And there are a handful of actual duels in this time period. One of them gets a whole chapter because no one wanted it to happen. And I focus the chapter on that to show the pull of violence and how sometimes it could be hard to even pull away from it if you wanted to. But the point is intimidation and fear. So as long as you can keep people afraid that they're going to get what's threatened with a weapon, punched, or challenged to a duel, then you win in a sense. And that you can do that with only a handful of duels, right? As long as people truly believe that that might happen. So for example, actually with Henry Wise in the episode that ends up in one of the duels in 1838, Henry Wise walks into the house with a newspaper and he says something along the lines of, I have here evidence that the Democratic Party is corrupt. And this congressman from Maine stands up, Jonathan Silly, and says, well, that's not true. We're not corrupt. And Henry Wise very dramatically and slowly turns so that he's facing Jonathan Silly and says, are you calling me a liar? Which basically is a way of saying, I'm going to challenge you to a duel if you're
We're on our way right now.
Exactly. That's and sure enough, Jonathan Silly is like, well, no, I didn't mean liar, and he backpedals very quickly. That's this kind of logic in action. And you see that happen right there. Unfortunately, this one gets kind of tangled up, but
it is a very convoluted thing because the third parties get involved and
exactly.
It's hard to sort out, but it has that feeling of a slow motion tragedy that no one knows how to stop.
Yeah, no, totally. And what's ironic in a book on violence is that when people learned that the duel actually happened, members in Congress, again, John Quincy Adams in his great diary, right? He describes these people standing around in little groups, whispering and looking out the road to see what's coming. Like everyone's kind of stunned that it actually happened, because normally in one way or another, you can sort of finagle your way out. And that's normally what happens. And the fact that it almost happened makes the point. There's a Southerner, actually in the House, I believe, who says something in the hearing of an anti-slavery advocate. And someone says, what can we do to keep these Northern anti-slavery people in line? And this Southerner says, just keep them scared for their lives. That'll do it. Just keep them scared. So it's not about killing, and it's not even necessarily about dueling, but fear of violence and fear of being challenged to a duel. This is why there is a big push for an anti-dueling law, only for the District of Columbia, but still an anti-dueling law, because people say very bluntly, this is what gives the South power. They use the fact that they're willing to duel, and Northerners back down.
Another thing that's astonishing in your book is, and I know you can't count it, but how many people are packing weapons in Congress? So you get the sense that they're all wearing weapons. And of course, that's not true, but there are lots of weapons.
There are lots of weapons. And it will not be surprising to hear that I spent a lot of time trying to see if there's any way I could calculate this, which you can't. The closest I came is in the 1850s. There's a wonderful North Carolina congressman by the name of David Outlaw. He's not a wonderful congressman, he has a wonderful name. And David Outlaw is corresponding with a friend. And at some point, they are trying to guess how many people in the house are armed. And they guess about, I want to say 70 people or something. It's some crazy number. And even if it's not that number, these are two members or a member of the House of Representatives guessing that. By the 1850s, there's a lot. I mean, so as you put it, like a lot of people are packing, partly because at that point, they truly don't know if there's going to be violence breaking out at any moment. You know, they're if you wake up in the morning and strap on your pistol or pick up your Bowie knife and walk into Congress, some part of you really fundamentally does not trust the institution of Congress to protect you in any way. So you are protecting yourself. And once everyone starts doing that, or many people start doing that, the institution is really kind of no longer functioning. So there's a South Carolina congressman who writes a letter to a friend and says, I have a gun in my desk. And I don't like carrying a gun, and I never have done it before. And the one time I tried doing it, I was uncomfortable. But I have one in my desk now, and it's loaded. Because if there's going to be warfare, I will fight with the South. He's talking about Congress.
Within the walls of the Capitol.
In the walls of the Capitol building.
Right. That's where he's going to fight for the South.
That's where he will fight for the South. And there are people talking that way, right? There are Southern congressmen saying, you know, if you folks do this offensive thing, we will take the Capitol and we will take it with force if necessary. It's ours.
I think one wag at some point in your book says, maybe we should have a gun rack up here so that people can check their guns at the door.
The person who says maybe we need a gun rack, and he's not actually entirely joking, is Preston Brooks, who later beats Charles Sumner to a pulp with his cane. So you don't really need a gun to do damage. But yeah.
Was there ever a shot fired in the Capitol?
Yes. There's an episode in which congressmen begin to fight. I want to say it's like the 1840s. They begin like a brawl, a physical brawl. There was at least one per session. And someone runs down from the gallery and into the chamber with a gun, wanting to shoot a member of Congress, and fires off his gun, but does not shoot the member of Congress. And the ball from the pistol goes through the wall, I believe it's the House wall, and hits a Capitol police officer in the leg. But that was a shot actually fired in the House chamber.
We need to take a short break from this conversation between Clay Jenkinson and the author Joanne Freeman, but we will return to it in just a moment. You're listening to The Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to The Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week, our special conversation between Clay Jenkinson and the author Joanne Freeman. And Clay, in this segment, you ask her about the violence during this period, and it wasn't really just a unique era. She says it was almost humorous because it was so over-the-top, kind of slapstick, in fact.
Well, you know, whenever two people who are not born fighters try to square off, it's usually a farce, and not real physical damage tends to get done. So I think she's having some fun with the level of sort of near violence or low-level violence that occurred, especially on the floors of Congress.
One of the things that really impressed me about this book, and Joanne Freeman, is the depth of investigative work and research that she did. And finding these records, these obscure records that were left behind. One of the things you talked to her about in this segment is the writings of a congressional clerk, Benjamin Brown French.
She discovered French's notebooks. There are a bunch of them, and they're in the Library of Congress, and she was able to read them. And he was a congressional clerk. He was a newspaperman. He was kind of an observer of things. He kept a very extensive set of diaries, and they had not really been examined much before. And she found them to be a gold mine. And one of the questions I asked her was, how does a scholar like you come to something like the French Journal? When you come to it, what joy that must be. And then what a pleasure to be able to bring something completely new to a discussion of something we all thought we understood. So Joanne did her homework, and that's what makes her one of America's great historians. Let's go back to my one-on-one interview with Joanne Freeman of Yale.
how do we avoid kind of thinking, oh, that was this era of frontier, the Jacksonian era and the violence, and I guess that's the way life was. How do we avoid getting stuck in some way in not realizing the gravity of this?
I felt like when I was working on the book, there were a couple questions like that I was up against. That's why I start with Dickens and the spitting of tobacco. One of the first things I wanted to do was like, yeah, no, this is not guys in black frock coats standing around pronouncing wonderful things, right? This is a very human, ugly, nasty place that you didn't expect it to be. The other side of that is from a distant vantage point that I had as a historian, initially, I thought some of it was funny because it's so over the top. It's like, you know, a big scrum of a fight and someone grabs someone by the legs and pulls him out and someone else says, you do not grab a gentleman by the legs. You know, I mean, some of this, it's very hard.
There's the toupee incident also.
Exactly. There's a toupee incident when there's a huge fight in 1858 and someone grabs someone's head to punch him in the face and his hair comes off, right? And everyone begins to laugh. So some of this, it's kind of slapstick and kind of funny. And that's absolutely true. I think one of the ways in which you avoid that is by being really keyed into what the people you're writing about feel. And one of the things in my work that I try to do as a political historian is I really focus on emotion as politics, right? So if you can get people pointing out something that seems wrong or something that scares them, and it's coming from them, not from you, that it could be a really effective and sometimes unexpected way of really putting your finger on a should or a should not about the past. In my first book, I think I called it the ouch factor because I wanted to write about political gossip and I couldn't find the gossip on paper because no one wanted to put political gossip on paper. And for a brief period, I thought, well, my career as a historian apparently has lasted 1 year and now it's over and I cannot write my master's thesis. It was nice while it lasted. And then I realized I wasn't seeing the gossip. What I was seeing was the ouch. He can't say that about him. How dare he say that about me? And the ouch shows you that absolute moment where like a line has been crossed. And if you can see enough of those and weave them together, you begin to get a sense of the sort of mental landscape of how people think things are supposed to work. And then you can see, like sometimes they think things are funny, which is awfully nice when they actually see things with a sense of humor, but you peg into the period in a way that is more growing from the culture of the time as opposed to us looking on with the distance of centuries and seeing people pull their toupees off. Although even that made them laugh at the time. So, you know.
And it broke the tension maybe.
It did. It did. Yeah.
So that can, laughter is a very useful tension breaker. Well, you mentioned gossip. That almost makes me want to turn to Jefferson's Annis, but we won't. Something that I found also interesting in the book is these investigations. So this is moving into your historiography for a moment. So some of these led to investigations where there would be 130 or 150 page report. So now we're going through one right now with the January 6th commission. There will be a long report. I'm sure it'll be longer than 150 pages, but that must be a historian's absolute thrill to come upon one of these investigative reports.
Oh, absolutely. But here's what's interesting about that is, so, you know, a congressional investigation, it has a report. And if you're lucky, like you just said, it's 150 pages. But people tend to see those reports in the same way that they see the congressional record, which is a formal account of things that are happening, right? So you read the congressional record and you say, this is how they're debating the tariff. And what you don't notice is the times when they say, there was a sudden sensation in the corner, and that is somebody flipping a desk and punching somebody, right? So there's all this other stuff going on. And in the congressional reports, in and of themselves, you're right that I like sing historian hosannas, like, yes, there's a long report. But for me, what was most valuable about them was the throwaway lines. On the one hand, it let me get the absolute dynamic of what happened, and you get eyewitnesses and people talking about what they saw, but you get people talking about what they thought and what they expected and how they responded. So, for example, in the long report on the episode that broke out in the Senate in 1850, when there's a gun pulled on another congressman, one of the people who testifies in the course of his testimony says something like, well, I saw something happen, but over there, and it involved Mr. Benton, and I jumped up on my desk to see, like we always do. was like, oh, okay.
Sudden revelation.
Right.
Desk jumping.
Oh, okay. So something happens and they all jump up on their desk. Let me get a look. There were all kinds of statements like that at the time no one would have noticed, but as an outsider from another time period, suddenly you're like, wait, I had noticed they were jumping on their desk. This is actually the expected thing when there's a fight in Congress. They all jump on their desk to get a good look. So there's a cultural component to the congressional record and to these reports that, in addition to all of the great facts that you're getting, you get these weird, fascinating insights into the dynamics of it and the way in which people are experiencing it.
And some people, some of the members of Congress were entertained by all of this. They were basically generic congressmen who weren't controversial, but they love to see a brawl open up on stage somewhere.
Well, so the main character in the book, who's a congressional clerk, Benjamin Brown French, his job as a clerk is to sit at the front of the House and record what's happening. And a lot of the time, his response to that is basically, he says to his brother at one point, my job is to sit here and watch it and write about it. Like, this is the best. This is amazing. And he has a newspaper column where he writes about it in his diary, and then he translates that into a newspaper column. But the other side of that, which goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is sometimes the fighting is scary to him and suggests that the union's falling apart. And that's particularly true when Congress can't open because they can't get officers into all the proper positions or elect a speaker because of the dissension. And then he begins to actually, and talks about this in his diary all the time. Like maybe this is it. Maybe I'm going to watch the union fall apart. And he's thinking that in the 1830s.
How did you discover Benjamin Brown French and his 11 volumes? And that must have been one of the great moments of your life.
That was, yes. I had a really hard time writing. So some of those 17 years were spent me trying to figure out how the heck to tell the story, because 70 fights, and I actually found like 120, and there were countless more, but I only included ones that I could absolutely prove. All of them could have had a chapter. You could pull apart any of them. So I didn't know how to tell this, and I didn't want to tell it as a purely chronological, and then there was a civil war, which just to me didn't seem fair. So someone speaking to me about it said, well, if you're not going to have time hold the book together, how are you going to hold it together? And I thought about that, and I thought, I know how, like a narrator or a character or a person. Maybe there's a person who could hold it together. And initially I thought that was John Quincy Adams, and that you could meet him at the beginning and kind of look through his eyes, and he has this amazing diary. But for a variety of reasons, he was too important and not neutral enough to serve in that role. So yeah, I knew Benjamin Brown French existed. Most people, if they know him because he was the commissioner of public buildings under Abraham Lincoln. And so anyone who knows about Lincoln knows him. But he kept this diary for most of his life. It's 11-volume diary in which he writes down what he saw in Congress, what he thought of it. It's the kind of diary that, again, as a historian, you kind of dream of. But in addition to that, he was a newspaper man. He had a newspaper column, and there was a kind of column that was like your man on the spot, in which he would literally be a correspondent. That's where that phrase comes from, a news correspondent. You would write these letters into the editor, corresponding with the editor, like, this is what I saw today. He had a newspaper column. He wrote poetry about politics that was going on at the time, this huge correspondence. It was like if I had created a character to be my eyewitness, it would have been this guy, to the point that, my book has like footnotes up the wazoo, in part because I wanted people to know I wasn't inventing the violence, and I did not invent Benjamin Brown French. But he made the book because he was so swept up in it. And initially, he's just a small town New Hampshire guy, Chester, New Hampshire. And then suddenly he's in Washington, and he's buddies with President Franklin Pierce. And that in and of itself leads to a lot of things. He's just the ideal, not super important, yet amazingly observant and sensitive guy on the spot. So for a lot of the book, I would pause and then just try and reconstruct, so what's he doing at this moment? What's he feeling at this moment? And I remember during the time he's really in the middle of politics, he has a lot to say about everything. So I didn't have to search very hard. At the end of the book, I was trying very hard to see what he felt about disunion, for example. And I'm like, what does he feel about like disunion about to happen? How can I figure this out? It's not in his diary. Like, don't let me down. By this time, I'm talking directly to Benjamin Brown French. Benjamin Brown French, like, give me a break here. He wrote a poem called Let the Union Slide. It's like, oh, thank you very much, Benjamin Brown French.
Is there an 11 p.m. somewhere in New Haven where you're French, give me a break here?
I did actually talk to French. I mean, I lived with the guy for like 15 years, right? He came along partway through the project. They now are no longer surrounding me, but for a while, I had like his diary and his columns and photographs. And, I met with a descendant of his who gave me the family tree. And I mean, so yeah, in his case, and no one knew who he was. No one cared about who he was. The descendant that I met in Chester, New Hampshire, he was like, why do you care about this guy? Like, I'm happy to talk to you about him. Why do you care about this guy? We gave his diaries to the Library of Congress, and we didn't think anyone would ever look at them.
How did you look at them? They're in the Library of Congress. How did you apprehend them?
They're in the Library of Congress. I mean, they are microfilm. So more often than not, I was going through microfilm reels. But in some cases, I got to just sit there with the diary. And so, for example, the duel that took place in 1838.
Silly wives.
Exactly. French goes to the dueling ground because he was friends with the person who's killed. He goes to the dueling ground to try and figure out what happened. And then in his diary, he draws a picture of the dueling ground and what he thinks happened, which then I got to include in the book. I got them to.
It's a lovely and really bad drawing, by the way.
It's a stick figure bad drawing made by a guy who was obsessed with this and like went to look at it.
Is there a biography of him?
There is not really a biography of him. I mean, there's an abridged version of his diary. He appears in a lot of books about politics in that area. But sort of an out and out straight beginning to finish biography, not really.
He probably deserves one. Well, you've done probably as close as that can come when as a subordinate figure. Talk a little bit about the radicalization of him, so that he, at the beginning, it's not clear what his politics are, but they're Democrat.
Right.
And that matters more to him almost than anything else. And he'd rather keep the Union together than not, and so on and so forth. By the end, he's really appalled by Southern intransigence. He's willing to fight on behalf of the end of slavery.
Yeah. His transformation early on is part of what sort of finally led me to realize, like, he's the heart of the book. He starts out as someone who's really worried about the Union, is one of these dough faces who doesn't want to talk about slavery because it's dangerous, who wants his party, is like, fervent believer in his party. People called it the democracy. It wasn't even just a party. It was like an entity all by itself.
Democracy.
Right. A democracy, the democracy. He was all about appeasing the South. And you can see in his diary and in his actions, all he's doing all the time is trying to appease Southerners so that they'll be okay. We don't need to talk about slavery. It's a Southern issue. We don't have a right to talk about slavery. So for a good chunk of the book, he's very much a dough-faced Democrat trying to make nice. Slowly over the course of the book, Southerners make it clear that they care about the South more than they care about their party. And so there's a certain point in the book where he begins to get very suspicious because he's bending over backwards all the time to appease Southerners. And there's a point at which he wants to get back into the clerkship. He loses it.
He loses the clerkship over these politics.
Exactly. That Southerners vote for a Southerner instead of giving it back to him, even though he pretty much deserved to get it again. And that like flicks a switch in him. He's like, wait a minute. Obviously, in his mind, should have been the guy. And Southerners basically say, yeah, whatever. We now want a Southerner in that position because it's going to matter.
Well, as we close, all I can say is I love this. Thank you. I hope we do.
So did I. I would love to, Clay. Call on me anytime. I would be happy to be.
All right. Well, let's check in together. But it is a thrilling reunion. And here we go. It won't be another 20 years.
It would be good if it weren't. I'm happy to work with you again.
Bye.
Wonderful to listen to Joanne Freeman. You can't see her on audio, but she is an animated conversationalist and lecturer, famous for her playful approach to these things. And that's something that I prize. I try to do that in my own work, David, is to make sure we're having fun, that history is sometimes very dark. And of course, this story is not a good one. It's the lead up to the Civil War, in which more than 600,000 Americans were killed. But she makes it a good read. and she takes joy in presenting her insights, and we are very fortunate to have had her. Her first book, Affairs of Honor, is a book that I really love because it talks about dueling, and I used her work extensively in my own study of Meriwether Lewis, because at the end of his life, when he was at odds with the War Department and made that fatal journey back towards Washington, D.C. in the fall of 1809, he was essentially involved in an affair of honor. And he said at one point in the cabin where he died, "It would be better for me to kill myself than let my enemies do it for me." And so I used her work with great respect and gratitude in my own study of one of the most complicated figures of that era, Meriwether Lewis. All hail to Joanne Freeman. So, with that, we'll see you next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.